The analogy I like to use is it's a little bit like if you got a whole bunch of musicians, just playing random notes, that's what I would call disease, where as opposed to everything working in beautiful harmony, the tissues and the elements of the tissues and the cells themselves are in this phase of illness, which we refer to as disease. PBM is like the conductor of the orchestra coming up to the podium, tapping his baton like this, and he gets the orchestra quiet, they tune, and then they start producing the most beautiful music. And this is how PBM is working. It's working on many different planes. It's something which I would refer to as entrainment. And so all these different pathways can be happening simultaneously. It can be affecting many different targets. And so simplistically to say you're just using a single wavelength to produce a single effect. No, I'm sorry, I don't agree, because I can produce PBM-like effects or PBM effects with many different wavelengths, and this has been demonstrated in the literature. There may be some which are better choices than others, and then there are decisions to do with the dosimetry, because with some of these wavelengths, there's an awful lot of energy attached to that photon, and you don't want to sort of overcook your supper. And then there are others which are very low energy, where it may take more to produce the effect.
Hey, this is Ari. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. With me today for, I don't know if this is round 3 or 4 or 5, it's hard to keep track of it at this point, is Dr. Mark Cronshaw, who is one of the top experts in photobiomodulation, the science of how light interacts with human biology. This is a very, very deep dive into the science of PBM, of photobiomodulation. And we get into a lot of different areas related to dosing, related to controversial, contentious topics, where there are disagreement among experts, all kinds of things. It's this continuation of the previous conversations that we've already had, the 2 episodes or 3 episodes that I've already released on this on the topic of PBM with Dr. Cronshaw. So if you have listened to those, you know that this is very geeky, very sciencey stuff, at times somewhat technical stuff. So keep that in mind. 2 things. Let me be very clear about this. Number 1, if you haven't already, make sure to listen to the earlier podcasts with Dr. Cronshaw. That will be very important background before you get into this conversation. And the other thing is, again, just a warning, this is very technical, geeky stuff. If you don't care, and probably a lot of you don't care to get into the real nitty-gritty of PBM science, you want maybe something more simple, here's a few mechanisms of how it works, go buy this device, sit in this position and, apply it in this way for 5 or 10 minutes. That's not what this is. This is a very, very deep dive into the science of how this is working, and a lot of complex, controversial, nuanced issues related to what it does and how to best use it to get the best results, and how it's working, and so on. So if you do want a very high-level discussion of PBM science, I think you're absolutely going to love this continuing conversation with Dr. Cronshaw. I've personally learned a lot from him. I've had many hours of conversation, not only in these recorded podcasts, but also outside of this. I think he's absolutely brilliant, one of the top experts in the world in PBM science, undoubtedly. So I have the utmost respect for him, and I'm a huge fan of these conversations, and I hope that you will get a lot of value from them, just as I did. Enjoy. Dr. Cronshaw, thank you so much for joining me, enjoying this conversation with you. It's been very enlightening. We've had a lot of outside communication as well, via email and phone calls and Zoom calls, and I'm learning a lot from you, and really greatly benefiting from this conversation. I'm fascinated with the knowledge that you have here, and I'm excited to continue this conversation with another podcast, another geeky photobiomodulation podcast that gets into the weeds and these key areas and certain key areas of controversy. So, with that in mind, let's jump straight into.
Hmm.
I think a good place to start would be wavelengths because you've hinted a few times in conversations we've had that you have a different view, I think, than most people, and certainly a different view than the one that I've presented. And you've hinted that you may anger me a little bit by presenting this view that maybe ruptures my way of thinking about things. So I would love to dig into that with you and sort of see how you think about wavelengths and what you think
Hmm.
maybe some of the big exceptions are in that area.
Absolutely. Well, the issues in regards to wavelengths are such that you can really look at from the perspective of which wavelength should I use? That's a very common problem. You know, people say, "Hey, I hear I need to use a red wavelength for this," or I hear a near infrared wavelength is going to be best for this, and this is a longer wavelength than some of the other wavelengths, and they said this is better for these applications. So this is one of the areas I got very interested in when I was studying for my thesis when I was doing my doctoral work, and I really dug into this and to try and understand, well, both what is it that the energy is doing for different wavelengths, and is there a specific wavelength that you've got to use to produce the response that you're looking at? And then I also looked at the differences between wavelengths in the red to near infrared. And then I looked outside the box to, well, shorter wavelengths like blue wavelengths, which are now being much talked about in the PBM community. Is this PBM or is this another effect? Because historically, the view was always it was a red to near infrared wavelength. And then there are longer wavelengths too, in the mid-infrared to the far infrared, which some people say, well, this is PBM too. So when you ask the question about wavelength, this is where you have to think really. I think in essence, what is it? What is the essence of the wavelength? I mean, the wavelength is referring to a packet of energy, right? And it's not a ping pong ball of different dimensions. It's not a anything other than a conglomeration of energy. I mean, we refer to it as the photon. And a photon is something which has got a magnetic field, an electric field, and then there's the length of the cycle. And according to the length of the cycle, this is what we refer to as the wavelength. So the shorter the wavelength, then the more energy that's attached to that unit that we refer to as the photon. So a very short wavelength's got a real lot of punch, whereas some of the longer wavelengths, it's more of a tickle than a punch. So this can start to have an impact then on the tissues in regards to which wavelengths might use for different indications. So, for example, dermatologists use blue and ultraviolet wavelengths, which are really short but very powerful photons, as it were, to kill bacteria, which might be causing facial acne, as well as to help treat other dermatological conditions where they're really wanting to apply a lot of energy there, as opposed to a small amount of energy. And that higher energy is producing quite a different effect than if you'd use something which is a longer wavelength, where you may just gently warm things up a little, and or at least that's the only thing you can feel. But then you may be achieving different things too, because the properties associated with the wavelength will be such as how deep can that photon go into the tissues. Now, if you've got something which is below the surface of the skin and use something which is going to get very highly absorbed in the skin, well, that's a rationale for choosing the one wavelength as opposed to the other. And so when you're thinking about PBM, first of all, you don't want to use something which is too hot and too strong, something which is going to start to denate tissues and coagulate proteins. So, maybe some of these very short wavelengths, like the ultraviolet ones that the dermatologists are using, these are not perhaps the best choices, particularly because some of them can be mutagenic. They can trigger off cancerous changes in the skin. Whereas if you're thinking about delivering energy just to the surface of the skin, then you can use quite a number of wavelengths, but the red one is one which is very familiar in the PBM community. largely because this is the one on which most of the research has been done. And so we know a lot about it. We know about its positive benefits in terms of stimulating the type of cell that produces collagen, fibroblasts. And we know that this can be something which is effective. Whereas if you start to think about longer wavelengths, and here these are ones that you can't see because they're just outside the visible spectrum of the human eye. But here you're looking at about 780 nanometers and longer, then these have got deep penetration. And so that's a better wavelength to choose if you want to reach something which might be a centimeter or more deeper into the tissues, as opposed to something which will be much more superficially absorbed. So, but the criteria in terms of selecting wavelengths in part depends on the amount of energy associated with the individual photon, as well as what is it that you're trying to achieve. Are you trying to do something which is superficial? Are you trying to do something which is deeper? And um, and then there's all this stuff in the sense that people say to you, no, no, you want to use this specific wavelength, a 1064 or a 1070 nanometer. This is the best wavelength, it goes the deepest and things like this. And that's not actually true.
Right. There's a lot. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So, I mean, there's a lot of ideas out there where people say, well, these are the wavelengths which are least absorbed in melanin, which is the pigment in your skin, and least absorbed in hemoglobin, blood. Because tissues contain melanin and hemoglobin, if you want to get in deeper, then you use these longer wavelengths because these have got what then they produce these graphs, these absorption curves. I mean, PBM guys, they just love absorption curves, these very complicated looking graphs showing the differential, and they say, look, when you look at the melanin.
And for people listening, if you want to look up what he's referring to, which I recommend doing, you can do a Google image search for the optical window and photobiomodulation, and you'll see these graphs that show the absorption curves of different compounds: melanin, water, hemoglobin. Is
Mhm.
there another one? Those are
Well,
the
well, that's a good point, you see, because they don't talk about protein as well. And
uh-huh.
tissues contain a lot of protein, and and also there is no weighting of the relative content of the tissues. So when I was looking at this in relation to the choice of wavelengths, I thought, yeah, sure, I can see from this graph that melanin is quite poorly absorbed by these longer wavelengths, like the 1064, 1070 nanometer ones, whereas the red ones, they are more highly absorbed. Um, but then if you think, well, how much melanin is there in tissue? Melanin, it's that layer of pigment which is present just as a more or less one cell deep at the base of your skin, after which there's not a lot of it in the deep tissues, if any. And so, whereas biological tissues are comprised largely of water, that's the single most predominant molecule present. You got 55 to 60% water present in the tissues. And you look at the water absorption curve and you think, oh, okay, well, the absorption curve for the 810 nanometer wavelength, which is a near infrared one, but outside the visible spectrum, but shorter than these ones that have got some lower absorption of melanin. That is, if you look at that optical window concept, that goes really deep. And you ask yourself, well, why? So I mean, that's more highly absorbed in pigments, and yet
Which wavelength was that?
that's the 810 nanometer. And
Okay.
the
Yeah.
answer is because it's got very poor absorption in water. And so as a result, it goes deeper into the tissues. And where the longer wavelengths, like the 980 nanometer and longer, these are, they're not highly absorbed. No, but there's significant absorption by water to the extent where this is providing a sufficient level of absorption because of the volume of water that's present to impede the delivery of that photon into the deeper layers of the tissue. So the water is actually more important than the melanin. And the same with blood. I mean, it's very familiar in the literature. People say, oh, no, no, no. Well, I mean, blood is a high absorber of some of these wavelengths, red and the immediate near infrared. They're very highly absorbed by hemoglobin, and they show the oxyhemoglobin, which is the oxygenated blood, and the oxygenated hemoglobin. There's a subtle difference between the two in terms of the absorption, and they get really excited about the difference in terms of the absorption in that. Whereas the amount of blood in tissues is really small. I mean, tissues are only perfused maybe by 1 to 2%, unless it's something like the thyroid or the brain. And so the amount of blood that's present isn't huge. And blood itself, well, it's about 50% red blood cells. Those red blood cells maybe contain maybe about 10% hemoglobin, which is the thing which is absorbing it. And that hemoglobin, the amount of free iron present is around about half to 1%. So when you start to do the numbers, you realize that actually the significance of the absorption in terms of blood and hemoglobin is hugely overstated by comparison to the effects of the absorption by other elements in the tissue, which may include protein, or which is predominant in tissue, or water, which is very highly predominant in tissue. So although the absorption curve may be lower, because there's so much more of it, it's much more important. And so this whole argument to do with between the various manufacturers, which is what it boils down to, is manufacturers' wars and some conceptual issues to do with the relevance of the absorption curve, is such that it's the wavelength which has got the deepest penetration into the tissues is around about 800 to 810 nanometers. And whereas the shorter wavelengths and the longer wavelengths up to 1070, they don't have deeper penetration, even if it's an absolute monster of a machine. And some of these 1064 nanometer ones, they're what's known as free running pulsed lasers. I mean, it's just the amount of energy they can pump out is what you can only describe as industrial. You're talking about tens of thousands of watts, but maybe only for a couple of millionths of a second. And
You're talking about 1064 nanometer lasers?
yeah, and so the amount of peak power there is vast. And they're saying, oh, this is really going to drill those photons deep into the tissues. Yeah, the on the bench studies show no, they don't, because the direct measurements of those wavelengths, I can direct you some nice studies that show at about a centimeter deep, it makes absolutely zero difference peak power. So I mean, there's lots of sort of misconceptions where people have taken an idea and thought, yeah, this is the answer. You build up these hugely powerful but very short duration little pinpricks of energy, but they're really steep spikes that are going deep into the tissue. No, they're not, and so there's in every area in science, there's always going to be an evolution in knowledge. And in respect to wavelengths, partly perhaps because of my participation, but also with other people, there's been a rethink where we're starting to think, well, actually, the relative significance of one factor as opposed to another. So if you then start thinking outside the box, which is in terms of the red to near infrared, which is the traditional range that we think of using for PBM, there's evidence of photobiomodulation as an activity present in shorter wavelengths, like the blue and the green and the yellow wavelengths, and that same with the longer wavelengths outside of the normal near infrared range, in the mid infrared as well as in the far infrared. And so you start to scratch your head and think, well, what is it? It's not a magic photon, which has got its name on it saying, hi, I'm Mr. PBM photon. It doesn't work quite that way. This is a transfer of energy, and it's to do with the transfer of this electromagnetic energy into something which then the cell can use one way or another. This is the primary issue. So then you have to think to yourself, well, what is it actually doing inside the cell? And that's a whole different question. So if you say to me, is wavelength important? Sure, it is, because I mean, from a pragmatic point of view, you want to choose a wavelength where you're not going to over-energize the cell. it's going to reach the target that you're reaching for. But if you say to me, well, can it only be specific wavelengths? I mean, does it have to be the helium neon 632.5 laser, as some people would claim? Or you want to use a 660 nanometer? It's much better than a 650 nanometer. Or no, you want to use a 1060. I'm going to say rubbish, because the best photon is the one that you got. So you can, all these things.
Okay, so sorry, go ahead.
That's right. I was just going to say you could apply many different devices, but then you have to understand the aspects in relation to the delivery of those photons, what's actually happening to them inside of the tissues, the impact they're having on the tissues, as well as the depth at which they'll be received. And this is a whole different argument because you're not just looking then at the absorption, which is the ability of the photon to get into the deeper layers, but also a phenomenon called scattering, where the photon enters and a little bit like in a pinball game, it kind of ricochets off, and that can then interfere depending on how much of that scattering, that this pinball effect you get, how deep it goes. And then there's the idea of, well, along the way, you can get a little bit of absorption and a little bit of continuation of the photon. And along the way, then things start to, it casts off some energy. What's happening to that energy? And you get some heat. And so then you then have to think, well, are there photothermal aspects to this? And is this a hazard, if things start to get warm? Because I hear, that if you heat things up, then this could be a problem. So when you ask a simple question such as, what do I think about wavelengths? Well, we could be here for hours, Ari, but
I get that sense. Let me push back on this a little bit. So you kind of, again, don't let me misrepresent anything you're saying, because I'm going to sort of simplify things here, but correct me if you disagree with this. You're sort of making a case for this idea that sort of a photon is a photon, and yeah, there's differences in how they penetrate into the tissues,
Mhm.
and what they're going to get absorbed by. But for the most part, it's electromagnetic energy. It's energy being delivered to the tissues. Is that reasonable?
I think that's a good start. I mean, there's
Okay.
a layer of finesse I'd add to that, which is that
Yeah.
some photons do have what we call a resonance with biological molecules. Now, what is resonance? Well, resonance.
Can we stay away from that for just a moment? I want to get to that later, but I just want to sort of push back on this topic that you were speaking about before. Is that okay? Okay. So from that frame, you were kind of brushing off the idea that sort of there's a magic photon, as you described it, that it's sort of this unique thing. It's sort of more, you're creating the idea that more broadly we can think of this stuff as a sort of packet of electromagnetic energy.
Yeah.
But there is a case, for magic photons. I mean, not magic photons, but there is a case for this high degree of wavelength specificity.
Mhm.
And I know we brushed UVB wavelengths right around 300 nanometers.
Mhm.
The activation of the circadian rhythm,
Mhm.
and via the eye pathway,
Yeah, yeah.
activating certain regions of the circadian clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the brain, depends upon, I think it's like 480 nanometer blue light, roughly in that range is where it's active the most, and it's not stimulated by wavelengths well outside of that, by red, or let's say far infrared, or things like that. Melanin in the skin is UVA predominantly, and UVB to some extent as well, specifically in the 300, 400-ish range.
Yeah.
So there is this specificity to very specific narrow bands of wavelengths that have unique effects. You can't get melanin synthesis, or the conversion of an hydrocolloid, the vitamin pre-vitamin,
Mhm.
with red light or far infrared, or something like that.
Well, in order to produce a biochemical effect, you have to have sufficient energy, right? This is basic 0101 biochemistry. And when it comes to um, turning dehydrocholesterol in your skin into provitamin D, which is the precursor for the formation of vitamin D, you need to have a pretty energetic photon, which is a UVB one. All right. And if you haven't got the energy, you don't get that effect. So sure. Um, but then you're looking at a very specific biochemical pathway, all right, associated with the manufacture of vitamin D from cholesterol. Whereas there are more broad aspects to PBM, where you're looking at a very specific biochemical pathway, right? Now, this has been something which has been latched onto by the PBM communities, indicating that all PBM activities are specific biochemical pathways where you're triggering off unique biochemical events by the combination of a specific wavelength of photon produce an effect. And so Professor Tina Carew, who's a Russian professor, spent a lot of time in her career looking at red wavelengths as well as 780 nanometer wavelengths, looking at the specific absorption of that by one particular unit of the component of the mitochondria, which is called the electron transport chain, where there's a specific enzyme called cytochrome C oxidase. And this was the route which explained everything and anything to do with PBM. This was the received wisdom for many years. People thought, yeah, you got to use a red wavelength, you got to use this particular near infrared wavelength because these correspond to the peak absorption of CCO, cytochrome C oxidase. And so all the textbooks then were full of this. These are the particular wavelengths you want to use. But then
Right.
when those studies were reappraised some years on, and repeated, then they found that actually the peak absorption for wavelengths for CCO was actually a blue wavelength. And it was around about
Really?
445 nanometers. And yet, this wasn't associated with a step increase in the production of ATP. And on the particular
Interesting.
parameters they employed, they actually saw inhibition of production of ATP. And so then this whole issue to do with that specific pathway was brought into question. Now, the reality is that the components that absorb the energy, this electromagnetic, what we call photon transduction, which is the conversion of the photon into something which is useful for the cell, is a fairly broadband effect. It's associated with what are referred to as transition metals. And transition metals in chemistry are things like iron, copper, magnesium, things like this. And these are relatively broadband receivers of red to near infrared energy. And when it comes to pigmented materials, ferrous materials are pigmented. They form porphyrins, hemoglobin, flavins, or a whole variety of other pigmented materials. Then there's a whole host of other wavelengths which can be absorbed by dark pigmented bodies, which is referred to as dark body radiation. So the concept then moved away from a specific photochemical process to maybe there's another mechanism that's operating here. And so then newer concepts are introduced looking at the effects and the importance of water as possibly the primary, what they refer to as chromophore, which is frankly a bit of a silly thing to say about water because water's got no color, and chromophore literally means a color thing. But it's the thing which absorbs the energy and which is one of the contemporary theories. So it's not to say that Carew was wrong in regards to her work to do with the absorption. She just was wrong with the emphasis that she gave to it. Okay. So when you start to then look at it in an even broader aspect to do with mechanisms, then you realize there's an awful lot happening, not just within the mitochondria, but also in other elements of the cell, that many different wavelengths can be having many different effects. And also there can be simultaneous effects in the cell membrane, to do with ion gates, to do with nuclear chromatin, which is the stuff that makes up the nucleus, along with things like the endoplasmic reticulum, which is like to use an analogy, it's like the sort of the Ford factory, for manufacturing proteins as opposed to cars, and which is this other internal aspect of the cell. And there are many other photoreceptors.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got some opsins, you've got things called TRPVs. There are indeed a whole host of other aspects to it rather than simply the electron transport chain. Now, I'm not saying to you that the electron transport chain isn't an important aspect related to the increase in activity you see when you expose tissues to energy at the sort of levels that we're using for photobiomodulation. I'm just saying that it's a multi-plane response in that there are many different things that are happening within that cell, and the consequences of that can be both within the cell, in the immediate vicinity of the cell, as well as the long distance effects. And so then you're thinking, well, okay, this is really getting complex, I mean, not just a simple
I'm
pathway.
sure that's what listeners are thinking right about now. Yeah.
The analogy I like to use is it's a little bit like if you got a whole bunch of musicians, just playing random notes, that's what I would call disease, where as opposed to everything working in beautiful harmony, the tissues and the elements of the tissues and the cells themselves are in this phase of illness, which we refer to as disease. PBM is like the conductor of the orchestra coming up to the podium, tapping his baton like this, and he gets the orchestra quiet, they tune, and then they start producing the most beautiful music. And this is how PBM is working. It's working on many different planes. It's something which I would refer to as entrainment. And so all these different pathways can be happening simultaneously. It can be affecting many different targets. And so simplistically to say you're just using a single wavelength to produce a single effect, no, I'm sorry, I don't agree, because I can produce PBM-like effects or PBM effects with many different wavelengths, and this has been demonstrated in the literature. There may be some which are better choices than others, and then there are decisions to do with the dosimetry, because with some of these wavelengths, there's an awful lot of energy attached to that photon, and you don't want to sort of overcook your supper. And then there are others which are very low energy, where it may take more to produce the effect that you're seeking. So, um,
Okay. Can I interrupt one more time? I have one more layer of pushback here, which is great job of presenting the case for many different wavelengths,
mhm,
creating either the same, activating the same or similar mechanisms, or that it's not so highly specific to very tight wavelength ranges that have these effects.
mhm,
Um, Let's present two arguments against this. One is, let's say you use blue lengths as sort of, let's say, activating cytochrome C oxidase, which had been historically thought to be unique to the red and near infrared wavelengths to some extent. Level, and I'm going to present this argument and then one more. But on a practical level, we know that, for example, blue light at the level of the skin tends to have a pro-aging effect, or at the level of the eyes,
mhm,
tends to have a pro-aging effect in terms of promoting cellular damage, whereas red light seems to be beneficial, seems to create more of a healing effect, an anti-aging effect, anti-wrinkle effect.
mhm,
I'm sure you've seen in
mhm,
recent years that have used, I think, torches on the eyes, or at least one of or two of the studies used torches on the eyes that had red light. I suspect, you
mhm,
may disagree, but I suspect that if the same study were done with a blue wavelength of the same intensity, that it would not have created a beneficial effect, but probably would have created harm.
Mhm.
So I'll leave that sort of the pro effect on eyes and skin versus in blue and red versus red as
Come in now?
what.
But I can deal
Yeah,
with
go for it.
it first before you go for number two. Okay.
Okay.
Because uh, I'm the man for this. I tell you, Harry, I love it.
Okay.
Um, it's to do with photon energy, right? Now, the amount of energy attached to the photon, technically we refer to as EV, which is the electron volts. Okay. Now, Praveen Irani in his laboratory at the University in Buffalo had one of his students, young, do a study with some cells which are called odontoblasts. And these are the sort of cells that form one of the structures in teeth, dentine. What he did with these poor little odontoblasts is he irradiated them, he exposed them to different wavelengths at different dosimetry, where they altered the dose according to the wavelengths. So because the shorter wavelengths are more energistic than the longer wavelengths, they only provided half the energy for a blue wavelength than they did with the red wavelength. And do you know what happened? They got exactly the same promotion and production of ATP um,
Mm.
with with the blue wavelength as they did with the 810. And so out of this, they then came up with some concepts, which is a way where you can kind of adjust the dosimetry according to the amount of energy, which is the number of electron volts per photon.
That's the Einstein's measurement
Yeah,
that you're
that's
referring
right.
to.
And so he came up with a way of calibrating the amount of dose you give according to wavelength, because you can produce identical effects. So when you're thinking about the damaging effects in skin, why is it producing damaging effects in skin? It's because it's generating what are known as reactive oxygen species, ROS. And the ROS that it's producing, that'll be a reflection of the dosimetry. If you were to step the dose down to a much lower dose, then it's not going to produce quite so much ROS, and then you might be seeing some biostimulatory effects, which is what Praveen's students found when he was looking at odontoblasts. Whereas if you use the same dose with the blue as you would as the red, which we know is beneficial for stimulating.
Mark, sorry to interrupt you. You were cutting out on my end. I don't know if it was if it's a problem with the Zoom recording, but you were cutting out sort of after you introduced Praveen Irani's concept
Uh-huh.
of Einstein's.
Well, the long and short of this is if you give an identical dose of the blue and the red wavelengths, and you don't scale down the dose for the blue wavelength, then because there's so much energy there, then you're going to generate a lot of ROS, which are very damaging to the tissues, and you'll see aging of the skin. Similarly, you can see degradation of the blue receptors inside of your retina, which is specific blue wavelength ones, that can cause you permanent optical damage. And it's been associated with a risk of age-related macular degeneration, for instance. So it's a dose-related response, which is related to the energy of the photon. So it's not because they're bad photons. It's just that the amount of energy per photon is maybe double what it would be if it was a near infrared one. So if you were to take the near infrared one and you were then to double the dose and expose that to your skin, then you're going to be saying, actually, this is causing some tissue damage. And that's exactly what Praveen did in one of his later studies. Well, no, actually, one of his early studies, I tell a lie, where he said, hey, with this 810 nanometer wavelength, which is regarded as one of the good wavelengths, for skin, um, on the parameters that he was using, he was able to prove histologically, which is in tissue microscopy, that he was seeing signs of damage inside of the skin when he used a certain amount of energy associated with that particular study. So when you step outside of the dosimetry recommendation for that wavelength, and you put far too much of that wavelength there, it produced tissue aging and tissue damaging effects. So it's not because the red wavelength has suddenly turned bad. It's just that then there's a lot more of them there, and it can then start to produce these same adverse effects. So you can produce comparable effects just by adjusting the dose. So it's not because they're inherently bad or good. It's all a reflection of the amount of energy attached per photon.
All right, I still have some resistance to this idea. I'm going to be honest with you because I mean, for example, the overall body of literature tends to show, with a wide variety of dosing parameters, that blue light, for example, tends to inhibit collagen synthesis in the
Uh-huh.
skin,
Yep.
whereas red light of varying parameters, you can certainly make it so excessive that it starts to cause a negative effect.
Mhm.
But at most parameters tends to have a pro collagen synthesis effect. Things like that make me think that there is
Mhm.
something to the magic, quote unquote, as you call it, the magic photon idea. But let me introduce this other idea. Let's say that I have no resistance to the
Mhm.
idea, everything that you've just presented,
Mhm.
and I'm certainly like I definitely I think that what you're saying is probably broadly true, but as I said, I still have I still think there's maybe a bit more to the specificity of wavelengths and unique effects there. Maybe I'm wrong. You certainly know more than I do about that, so we'll leave that aside for now. The optical window. I know that you spoke to this earlier, and you sort of made the case that this is much more complex than most people have historically thought of it. However, there's we can come back to this simple thing of, let's say you take a flashlight, a
Mhm.
regular old flashlight, you shine it through your hand, as most kids do in a dark room, and you notice that it's predominantly red wavelengths that come through the other side of your fingers or the other side of your hand. There is still this
Mhm.
very clear, even if we accept the frame that all these different wavelengths, this is a slight misrepresentation of what you're saying, or maybe a significant one, but let's say we accept the frame that all these wavelengths have lots of overlap in activating similar mechanisms and triggering similar effects. There's still a big difference in terms of the penetration in tissue of these different wavelengths. And, blue and UV, my understanding is that they don't really penetrate beneath the skin to any significant degree. They can't get beneath that barrier, whereas you get into the reds and near infrareds, and you have a dramatic difference in the degree to which those wavelengths can penetrate below the skin deeply into the tissue. So even if we were to accept, let's say, the extreme frame of all wavelengths basically do the same thing, it's just energy, as packets of energy. Let's say we were operating in that frame, there would still be
Mhm.
this huge difference of the ability of wavelengths to actually penetrate through the skin into human tissue, and therefore there would still be a strong argument for red and near infrared.
Hey, I'm not
Do you
arguing with
disagree
you.
with that?
I'm not arguing with that at all. I mean, I was
Okay.
just my bone I was picking was associated with this specific photochemical relation between a wavelength and the outcome, and really it's energistics. Because I mean, when you're cooking, if you don't if you put things into a really really hot frying pan, it's going to burn fast. And whereas if you let it heat up slowly, it won't. And it's a similar idea with these wavelengths. If there's a lot of them, you're going to produce a rapid effect, which can then be damaging. If there's less of them, then you won't. I think optical penetration is indeed a key part of the decision process when you're thinking about the applied aspect of PBM. But what you will notice from the point of view of the consumer is now there are all these multi-wavelength devices that are coming onto the market where you can mix wavelengths. You can have a bit of blue and a bit of red and a bit of near infrared, and and so you think, so well, why are they doing this? And there's I think there's an awareness that some of these wavelengths have got properties which can be useful, but perhaps in synergy you can start to achieve multi-layered effects. So For example, blue wavelengths are the optimum wavelength for generating a chemical called nitric oxide, which is a very potent vasodilator. So it makes the blood vessels wider, so you get more oxygen getting into the tissues. And it does that by converting some nitrogen precursors called nitrosyls into nitric oxide, which then diffuses into the dermis, and then you get these deeper tissue effects from that very small molecule. And so blue wavelengths are regarded as the optimum for vasodilatation. And also, there's enough energy there that they can be useful maybe for disinfection, which is why people use them for some skin disorders. And if you combine that with a red wavelength, then you can start to get into the dermis, which is the next layer in of the skin, and you can then be producing a simultaneous different effect. So you can then be disinfecting the surface layer, maybe generating some useful biomolecules, which will then improve the blood supply to the base of a wound, say. And with the red wavelength, you can be starting to produce some stimulatory effects, which will then promote wound healing. So when you start to think in terms of 3D management of, say, an infected ulcer, say you got an infected ulcer in your tongue or something, you might want to have some surface disinfection. You want to maybe get some analgesia, some pain relief. And at the base of the wound, you want some stimulation. So then the immune system is going to be more active, better able to deal with any pathogens, as well as going for good wound resolution. So when you start to think in terms of a multiplanar effect, then you can start to see why this concept of mixing wavelengths can be quite interesting.
Let me real briefly though that what I brought up before, that there's a pretty sizable body of literature that shows blue wavelengths have a negative effect on collagen synthesis. I've
Mhm.
seen there are a number of different devices on the market, LED devices and this has been true for a very long time,
Mhm.
that some of these pad style devices have blue and red wavelengths. They never provide any particular sort of scientific rationale for why they've included blue in there. But it's sort of like some of them incorporate yellow and green, and sort of this idea, this vague notion that like more colors are better for some reason, but there's never any study that backs up those claims. If blue light, let's say somebody's using this device on their face, for example, you presented a case that talks about certain mechanisms, the nitric oxide blood circulation, that may lead to blue wavelengths having a synergistic or beneficial effect. But somebody's using a device on their face for facial skin anti-aging, and they're getting pro collagen synthesis effect from the red wavelengths, but now the opposite effect, an anti-collagen synthesis effect from the blue wavelengths.
Well, I mean, it's a dose-related response. So it depends on the strength of the blue energy. I mean, nobody's going to start to use really powerful blue LEDs in close proximity to the skin if they're looking to
I am aware of one LED panel manufacturer that has started to incorporate uh, powerful LED
well, I
in
mean, if you've
the
got
blue
access,
wavelength.
maybe, but I mean,
It's
um,
random, like one LED, blue LED here and there in a large, powerful panel.
but then if you're looking at the overall dosimetry, um, because it's a dose-related response, it's not the best wavelength for collagen stimulus, but neither is it automatically going to inhibit it if it's at a very low dose.
Right.
But then it's going to have very limited penetration into the dermis, where most of the fibroblasts, which are the cells that form the collagen, rest. So it's not the best choice. And so you have to be careful about the dose in case you overdo it, and then you're going to produce these negative effects. Plus, the penetration of the photons isn't going to be that great. So, I mean, yeah, when it comes to facial aesthetics, I wouldn't be charging out immediately to buy a blue LED face mask. Although those blue wavelengths may have some benefits if you got some skin disorders, and to have
Yeah.
disinfect.
Hmm.
So I think this is a conversation where I think you can say, yes, blue wavelengths certainly do have hazards associated with them. Um, but that's all to do with the amount of the energy that's present rather than inherently associated with the color. The other
Yeah.
aspect of it is the ability of the photon then to be able to deliver the goods into the deep layers of the tissue. Without a shadow of a doubt, if I was looking for something that was going to promote, more youthful skin, I'd be going for a red to near infrared wavelength and possibly a mixture of the two so you can start to produce the desired effects. As for the blue
Right.
wavelength,
Again, even in this framework where we accept the idea that many wavelengths have and activate similar mechanisms, I still feel like we arrive largely back at the red and near infrared wavelengths just by virtue of sort of physics of photon penetration into the tissue. Thanks.
yeah, well, now I'm really going to upset you, Harry, because I mean,
Okay, go ahead.
there's, yeah, I think that when it comes to some specific aspects of PBM, the first law of photobiomodulation is that you've got to have the photon there to at a sufficient dose be able to affect the change which you're seeking biologically. And so if you've got a wavelength which isn't going to reach that target, then that's just not going to work. Now, this is coming from photochemistry, right? And I think that's absolutely the case, However, there's an awareness that things like LEDs, which are really quite superficial in terms of their penetration, they should be used some quite deep tissue effects. And so you start thinking to yourself, well, how can that be? And the photons just aren't getting down there, and even if you're there for a long period of time, the amount of photons that's penetrating into those deep tissue layers is slight. You may be talking 0.2 to 0.6% of the surface dose getting through to the deeper layers. So it takes a long, long, long time to get up to that critical threshold where you can start to produce the sort of effects that you're looking at. And it's possible to do that, if you've got 20 minutes to an hour to sit around, by an LED panel, you might start to get above that threshold. But along the way, you may be warming up some of the superficial layers of tissues. So you need to then use a low output power LED. Otherwise, you might end up overheating some of the tissues. And so most of these things for extended use, like the pods and things, they're more or less all of them about sort of 25 to 30 milliwatt per square centimeter output devices, which is quite low. Now, um, so is there another pathway? So I asked myself this question, and I thought, well, maybe there's another pathway. Now, Mike Hamblin, and I'll bring in an authority, as a supporter. I think I need supporters. You're on the rampage, Harry. Um, he would say, yeah, well, I mean, you can produce systemic effects. Okay, so how does that work? Well, systemic effects are all mediated through skin. Now, we used to think of skin just as being this sort of layer of tissues to protect the insides of you from damaging environmental factors, whether it's excessive ultraviolet or other factors which could damage your organs. But actually, skin is a very complex organ. That it's got a neuroendocrine interface, so much so that one author of a paper I read recently suggested this is like the third brain.
Mhm.
There's
That was a fascinating paper, by the way. Thank you for sending me that
They,
paper.
they call it the neuroendocrine axis because so many of the elements which are highly active in the nervous system, chemicals like serotonin, the happy drug, and noradrenaline, which is another thing which stimulates the nervous system, as well as dopamine, which is a very important mediator of mood and focus and things, as well as some other important hormones like adrenocorticotrophic hormone or luteinizing hormone. And these are very powerful hormones that start to have distant effects. These are all produced in the skin. And so these skin generated mediators can then be picked up by the body and they can start to produce distant effects. So that's one pathway, but there are others as well because some of the cell types inside of the skin have got a specific close relation to the nervous system. So melanocytes, which are the cells we more familiarly think have been associated with producing pigments. So on a nice sunny day, they're triggered off, then start generating this pigment to protect your skin against excessive exposure to UV, that nice tan. They're actually descended from the same cell line that in embryology results in the development of the entire nervous system. They're what's known as neural crest derivatives. And so really it's a highly specialized type of nervous tissue. And so there's a very complex interrelation between melanocytes and their production of neurotransmitters, because they're not just producing melanin, they're also producing these other things, as are some other cell lineages all in within the skin. And then beyond that, there's other pathways associated with nerves that actually get into the skin. And it's been found that the outer sheath of some nerves contains something called myelin. And we used to think this is a bit like the plastic coating around an electric cable,
Hmm.
just to insulate the
Insulation.
nerve, and but actually myelin's got a hidden feature in that it's been found that myelin, because of its optical properties, can act just like a photo-optic guide, and it can help transmit the photons along its length. And this has been measured. They found that naturally axons, which are nerve cells, produce these things called biophotons. And this is where energy, as it's processed, can then release little packets, of tiny, minuscule amounts of little sparkles of photons, which are then transmitted along the myelin. And this is a super fast, it's going as fast as the speed of light, which is then going along to be received at the cell body. This is associated with some changes in nuclear transcription factors, and this has been associated with an increase in mitosis. It's been proposed as being associated with being an important element in nerve regeneration, and it may have a whole host of other effects because the body is full of light-sensitive molecules, even the deep tissues like your heart and things that just never see the light of day in normal circumstances. These are very, very light sensitive because they have inherent to them what are known as opsins, and opsins are related to the same sort of thing that you have in your eye. We have opsins and rhodopsins, which help us to see, just as I can see you now. But there are lots of other types of opsin where the stimulus doesn't produce a visual response, so the cells don't have eyes, as it were, but they are very responsive to light. And so this is an area which Anne Liebert has written about, and her group in Sydney, where they're looking at other mechanisms associated with photobiomodulation. And this is so remarkable because we're just at a point where we're so far moving away from this previous idea of it being purely a photochemical response inside a specific molecule inside of the mitochondria. And we're looking at all these other possible mechanisms that help explain something which is otherwise now inexplicable. That you can get someone who sticks some really low power LEDs on top of their head and it can start to treat their Parkinson's disease. Yeah, the photons themselves, how are they getting into the brain? And so it's been suggested maybe this is maybe in part a systemic effect to do with the generation of these neurochemicals. It may be due to hidden transmission pathways, which could be associated with myelin. We just don't know. What we
Yeah,
do.
that's I think a remarkable idea that I have not encountered in anywhere in the literature
Mhm.
as of right now. That not only this distinction between systemic versus local effects, sort of, are you delivering photons through the skin, through the, let's say, the bone in the case of through the brain, and then brain tissue where those photons are then triggering this photochemical reaction in the cells this direct photon cell or photon mitochondria reaction? Or are you triggering systemic effects through the skin, through the blood, and now things are going systemic and altering different parameters in the blood or maybe the nervous system. And now this additional layer, which is potentially how photons are interacting with myelin sheaths, and maybe these photons are actually able to penetrate much more deeply than we than we currently conceptualize through these sort of hidden pathways that we're not really aware of currently.
Absolutely. I mean, it's almost like cells have got cable. You know, I mean, it's a hidden mechanism, and this whole concept, I think, is amazing because it helps then to explain what's otherwise the inexplicable, and as to how it is that a surface application of a really weak source like an LED can start to produce some very deep effects. And in truth, it's probably a combination of all of these different things. You know, there's probably um, some photons getting through into the dermis from an LED with the protracted exposure, along with a multi-layered systemic as well as possibly other mechanisms. I mean, hair can be a photooptic guide, teeth can be a photooptic guide. You know, we are inherently all very light sensitive. All of our bodies are biologically light sensitive. But it's not just,
Here's
you know,
can I ask one thing that makes me somewhat skeptical of
Mhm.
this idea?
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily incompatible. I'm sure that there's probably ways that both things could be true. But what makes me skeptical of the idea that, let's say, these very low power devices could be delivering significant quantities of photons sort of directly to those tissues
Mhm.
is um, just the sunlight. You know, if it were the case that, let's say, our brain could receive significant quantities of photons through such a low power device that affect a measurable change, then wouldn't we, just by going out in the sun for half an hour or an hour, like I'm a surfer, for example, so I might spend sometimes 3+ hours outdoors in the bright sun. If I'm in Costa Rica,
Mhm.
an enormous dose of very intense sunlight. Wouldn't my brain be getting bombarded with just maybe vastly too much photonic energy in a case like that if it were so sensitive to even very low intensity lights?
Well, I mean, the evidence shows that some ambient light, sunlight, can be producing biologic effects. People suffer from SAD, seasonal adjusted disorder,
Uh-huh.
where because in the winter months they're not getting enough exposure to light, then they start to suffer from mood disorders, and so then a little bit like bears, you know, they start to hibernate, you know, their brains really, they're not very active. Um, the body being the beautiful self-regulating machine that it um, is responsive and defensive, and there are
Yeah,
mechanisms inherent
I thought you might say that.
which then help protect us against excessive stimulation. So when you start to have saturation of large areas of the tissue, then this can then not produce the positive effect that you're seeking. Now, this has been found in some of the brain studies where they've been looking at just generalized helmets that treat the whole of the cranium, as opposed to things which then are targeting specific areas in the brain, and they see that the one where they're targeting specific areas is producing the positive effect, whereas when they're radiating everything, it doesn't produce that same positive effect. It doesn't produce any harmful effects, but it will produce not produce the desired positive effect. So I think when you start to split between the management of disease and living in health, um, I think a little bit of ambient light is a great thing. You know, it's undoubtedly associated with human health and well-being, but you can have too much of a good thing, but that tends to be self-regulating, because if you do and you're not have enough skin protection on there, you get cooked, and you know it. And you have to protect your skin against getting sun aged, and you can end up developing various unpleasant skin conditions, including various carcinomas and things. So the dosimetry element is still there. As far as producing the happy events, well, everybody knows on a bright sunny day you feel good, and that's serotonin, and that's why people are happy. You live in one of the happiness capitals of the world at the moment. You're in California. You've got so much sunshine, and this is something which is a mood enhancer. And whereas those who are permanently, as I am at the moment, looking out the window, in the frozen north of the south of England, we have very little exposure to light. I go to the office, and do my work, and I come home and it's dark again, and the amount of exposure of light I get, it's to some artificial light instead of that beautiful natural stuff. Natural light itself, of course, is a mixed bag, between ultraviolet, which can be harmful, the visible spectrum, which is mostly in the blue to red wavelengths, through to the infrared, and with only a tiny amount of UV present. And so when you're thinking about using scientifically as a medicine light, which is what photobiomodulation is all about, then how good is ambient light? They used to use ambient light years ago in the sanatorium in Switzerland to help people recover from tuberculosis, and they had these things like sun lounges. The original work that was done by Finson, who won the Nobel Prize for this, was with bright, intense light in order to kill off tuberculosis in the skin. And so he was into sort of high intensity antibacterial effects, but I presume also he'll have had a photobiomodulatory effect. There will have been some attenuation, and
Hmm.
so I think we could go around the houses on this one, Harry. But I think yes, light is terribly important to health. That's
Yeah.
indisputable. But if you want to start to produce specific effects for specific occasions, like a sports injury, or to help you with a particular illness, then PBM, selecting your tool and getting the dosimetry right, that's more like medicine.
Yeah. Dr. Cronshaw, I'm really enjoying this discussion. I can't wait to dig into this more with you. We'll have to cut this one off here. I would love to pick up tomorrow if that's a possibility for you, if you have another time slot at the same time tomorrow morning. And we can discuss that after. But we need to get into. I'm very interested in this idea that you keep touching on, and I keep preventing you from really going into it, which is around entrainment. I think we need to get into that. I'm very curious to see if that relates to pulsing in any way, as some people have proposed theories related to that. May or may not. I'm curious to see what your answer is. And what else? Lasers versus LEDs, the biphasic dose response and the multiphasic response. So much more to get into. And then we need to get into the philosophy of care, as you called it, your sort of practical framework, the how-to guide of how you actually do this. There's just so much to talk about and so much complexity. And with all of your accumulated knowledge and the way that you address layer by layer, piece by piece of this story, it's taking us a long time to get through each individual topic. But I think that it's so important to really apply this level of nuance and elaboration on all these issues. And I think the big lesson from what you're trying to communicate, I think the meta lesson is the story is really much more complex than most people realize. And so with that said, I hope everybody is enjoying this, geeking out on all the complexity of photobiomodulation science. Dr. Cronshaw, I can't wait to continue the conversation.
It's going to be my pleasure, Ari. But I think it was Einstein that said any fool can make something more complex. I hope by the
Hmm.
time we finish, we'll have simplified this. And
Yes.
we will. But for those who are listening, if you can just come along for the journey at the end of it, the view from the top is beautiful.
Yes. Beautiful. Beautifully said. And I love that quote from Einstein. Thank you so much, Dr. Cronshaw. I'll be in touch with you, so we'll arrange the next one.
You bet. Okay, thank you.